Imagine for a moment that we were to take all of the Studio Ghibli movies and put them on a line ranging from fantasy to realism. What would that look like? First, you have the honorable mention of Nausicaa in the Valley of the Wind, followed by Castle in the Sky. Floating magical worlds, alien jungles, automatons. These would decidedly go pretty far over in the fantasy end. They take place in a world that's almost nothing like our own. Next, you have Grave of the Fireflies, a film about two abandoned children struggling to survive at the close of World War II, and we can pretty safely put this over on the other end of the spectrum. But as we start to drop in more Ghibli films, something interesting happens. There are some clear outliers that are completely fantasy or completely realism, but overall, most of them fall somewhere in between. These films in the middle incorporate elements of fantasy with more realistic premises, like witches dealing with burnout or forest spirits helping children cope with an ailing parent. Or, my personal favorite example, Ponyo. Ponyo exemplifies what's so special about this tendency of Ghibli films to exist at the intersection of fantasy and reality. The film is able to cram so much magic into its story while still being firmly grounded in a very human, relatable narrative. And because of this unique position, to view Ponyo through a lens of pure fantasy or pure realism is doing a disservice to the film. It's only examining one half of a greater whole. Rather, to more fully understand it, we must look to a literary tradition that's been blending the real and the fantastical for decades. I'm talking, of course, about magical realism. Magical realism can be a bit tricky to talk about because despite the seemingly simple name, most folks tend to misunderstand it. It's realism that's magical. I mean, what could be so hard about that? But with such a seemingly self-evident name, everyone tends to come up with their own definition without realizing that what they think is magical realism might be completely different from what someone else thinks. They might think of Dune as being magical realism because it's a very grounded, realistic fantasy, or Onward because it's a fantastical story with many elements of reality. And so when they stroll into a magical realist novel like Kafka on the Shore and are met with whatever the hell that was, the results can be disappointing. So how do we understand magical realism? And what can it tell us about Ponyo? Well, we first have to acknowledge the deep literary, cultural, artistic, and political roots that hide behind such a deceptively simple name. In the aftermath of World War I, a group of artists in Weimar, Germany pioneered a style of painting known as New Objectivity, which rejected the wild, nightmarish images of expressionism in favor of a more, objective look at life. German art critic Franz Roh was captivated by the New Objectivists. Their work was unflinchingly realistic, and yet they retained a certain sense of absurdity. As Maggie Ann Bowers wrote, they captured a mystery in the concrete. And so, in 1925, Roh dubbed the New Objectivists as practitioners of a new style that blends reality with a twinge of magic. He called it Magical Realism. When Roh's work was translated into Spanish in 1927, it fell into the hands of Cuban writer Alejo Carpentier. A world traveler, Carpentier was enamored by the diverse cultures and art he saw throughout much of Europe. Upon his return to Latin America, Carpentier refined Roh's magical realism, which he criticized as being cold and artificial, into his own marvelous realism, which proposed that the world's magic is born not from absurdities, but rather from diversity of culture, geography, politics, and history. Magical realism as we know it today came about as a combination of both Roh and Carpentier's definitions, as well as a slew of other influences from across the globe, including Cervantes, Kafka, and Günter Grass. Of course, it's almost impossible to discuss magical realism without bringing up Nobel Prize winner Gabriel Garcia Marquez and his 100 Years of Solitude, a book whose influence you may recognize in Disney's Encanto. Marquez sought to bring to the page the vibrant experiences of his youth growing up in Colombia. In 100 Years of Solitude, he traces the lineage of the fictional Buendia family and the town of Macondo, where folktale and fact blend together. Things like women who eat dirt and visits from ghosts are treated with the same sense of regularity as morning coffee. In one instance, one of the Buendias falls in love with a mechanic who seems to be permanently accompanied by a swarm of yellow butterflies. When they first meet, there's a strange non-emphasis on what you would think is a noteworthy event. She would not let him speak. She would not even let him come through the door, which a moment later she had to close because the house was filled with yellow butterflies. If it sounds like I'm cutting the scene short here, I assure you, I'm not. That's the first and last time the butterflies are mentioned here, and Marquez treats all magic throughout the novel with this same nonchalance. Over the years, magical realism became a worldwide phenomenon, gaining a large following in many countries, including Japan. And just as magical realism spread first from art to literature, it's just as easily made the leap from print to screen, as seen in the fantastically surreal works of Masaaki Yuata. Studio Ghibli has never been a stranger to adapting and borrowing from literature. Many of their films, like Howl's Moving Castle, are adaptations of novels or fairy tales, and so it's no surprise to see many aspects of the magical realist tradition being employed in films like Ponyo. We can see Ponyo's magical realist influence from the very beginning of the film. The opening sequence introduces us to Fujimoto, the sea sorcerer, in a vibrant underwater world filled with iridescent ocean creatures and mysterious elixirs. Clearly, the world of Ponyo is filled with magic. In the following sequence, however, we're shown something very different. A small town by the sea and Ponyo swimming alongside modern commercial trawlers, eventually washing up in a discarded glass jar. This opening sequence reveals that Ponyo's pure, magical world underwater lies just beneath our own deeply flawed, polluted world. They're one and the same. This isn't like Harry Potter, where the wizarding world is entirely isolated from the Muggle world. Rather, Ponyo is clear that our world is magical. The magic that we're about to witness comes from the world we already live in, a sentiment carried by many of the great magical realist writers. As Garcia Marquez said of his own writing, "There's not a single line in all my work that does not have a basis in reality. The problem is that Caribbean reality resembles the wildest imagination." As Carpentier made clear, much of the magic in magical realism comes from the unique cultural perspective of the artist. In Ponyo, we can see the influence of Japanese Shinto beliefs of animism in the film. Animism holds that all aspects of existence possess a living spirit, and in the case of Studio Ghibli films, this most often expresses itself in the form of spirits representing the natural world. Like the butterflies in 100 Years of Solitude, Sosuke and Ponyo are repeatedly pursued by water spirits sent from the sea by Fujimoto. These spirits are an expression of animist philosophy, but they're also another example of Ponyo's mission to highlight the magic inherent in our ordinary environments. In Ponyo, storms aren't just storms, they're works of great magic that demand awe and respect. Another important aspect of Ponyo's magic that's common in many Studio Ghibli films is its scope. In magical realist stories like Ponyo, the tendency is for magic to be of a more household variety. As Maggie Ann Bowers writes, "The magical aspect of magical realism was not of the religious nor of the witch and wizard kind, but was the magic of being, which celebrated the world's rational organization. Ponyo is no exception, celebrating the world through the use of its magic in small, interpersonal interactions rather than grand epic quests." Throughout the film, Ponyo uses her magic to do favors for her friends. She unclogs pipes for Lisa, grows candles for Sosuke, and stops a baby from crying. The magic of Ponyo is not a replacement for realism, but rather an enhancement of it, revealing itself in moments that celebrate not only our environment, but also our relationships. And, as is common in magical realism, in Ponyo, that which is extraordinary is treated ordinarily. Once again, I'm reminded of 100 Years of Solitude, when the Buendia family gathers around to examine a newborn member of the family. He had something more than other men, and they leaned over to examine him. It was the tail of a pig. They were not alarmed. No matter how absurd or magical things get, for characters in these stories, they're just another part of life. When Sosuke presents Ponyo to the ladies at the retirement home, they respond not with shock or disbelief, but with amusement.
"Her name is Ponyo. She likes to eat ham, and she can do magic."
"Maybe she could use some of her magic to fix my hips and back."
Later on, when Ponyo uses her magic to soothe the crying baby, we are again shown that people in the world of Ponyo seem to welcome magic with open arms. Prehistoric sea creatures flood the streets, and senior citizens are spontaneously granted the ability to breathe underwater. And yet, through it all, the characters of Ponyo carry an attitude of acceptance, as though the fact that magic exists in the ocean is something that should be obvious. So, Ponyo is undeniably a magical realist text, at least in form. But magical realism goes so far beyond mere aesthetics. In 100 Years of Solitude, magical realism is used to critique the absurdities of war and industrialization. In Kafka on the Shore, it's used to develop a coming-of-age story. As Jason Sehan would say, magical realism involves a tacit acceptance of the fundamental brokenness of reality. The lack of commentary is the commentary. In Ponyo, the brokenness of reality explored is the pollution of Earth's oceans. And so, the sea as a source of magic serves an almost paradoxical double meaning. It represents both the absurd perversions of nature that Rowe and Sehan spoke of, while also being a source of life and wonder, as in Carpentier and Marquez's marvelous realism. These contradictory, simultaneous truths are what magical realism hinges on. The world is both entirely magic and entirely mundane. And this is especially true of Ponyo. The only truly mystical being present is the sea goddess. The rest of the creatures seen in the film are all real, whether they be prehistoric fish or personified waves. Ponyo argues that the ocean doesn't need altering to be seen as magic. It already is. Once again, magical realism is all about finding the mystery in the concrete. Ponyo takes it one step further than merely identifying the magic of the ocean, however, and implicitly makes the argument that what is magic is sacred, and what is sacred must be protected. When the sea's natural balance is upset by human interference, massive flooding occurs in a complete overlap between the world of the ocean and the human world. And though the reactions of the characters in the film are benign, the gravity of the consequences for failing to care for our environment is nonetheless heightened by the story's magical elements.
Sasuke, please listen. You have to trust me. You're the only one who can save the planet. Do it now. Do it!
However, in spite of all the supernatural occurrences, like many magical realist stories, Ponyo carries with it a current of hope. Once you recognize the magical wonder of the natural world around you, you can begin to love and protect it. Sosuke's unapologetic love for Ponyo is representative of a greater appreciation for the underwater ecosystems of the ocean as a whole. And it's this love that ultimately turns the hearts of the film's characters, opening their eyes to the wonders of nature. In the same way, magical realist stories like Ponyo turn the hearts of their audiences too. Pulling from decades of artistic, literary, and cultural movements from across the globe, Ponyo calls upon the magical realist tradition to remind us to take a moment to appreciate the magic of our natural environments, and to do our parts to keep that magic alive.